that our recommendations are relatively, I don't want to say general, but we're not proposing specific legislation at this point. Our colleagues in the legislature have many more things to do than the objective assessments and the governance questions that we've raised here. And all of those things are interrelated. So rather than take one piece of the elephant and say this is what it needs to look like, we are hoping to add to the discussion that's going to occur in the legislature and help illuminate that. But we respect the prerogative of the legislature to decide what the policy of Ohio ought to be and how we ought to attain it. The executive summary begins on page 6. On page 7 is an important thing to note, I believe. EMIS, the process, the program, the software by which attendance is recorded in Ohio, has some internal controls that are designed to make sure that students aren't in multiple places or more than one place or not there at all. Because of an upgrade of the software in the fall of 2014, those controls are not in place. One of our recommendations in the report is that ODE go do a look back to determine whether we had any failures in the system due to that particular non-operation. We have, beginning on page 8, a summary of the recommendations we have for ODE. One is to update the manuals. The EMIS system was updated. Some operational rules and definitions were changed. There was no update to the manual. So if you're an EMIS coordinator in a charter school and you're trying to do what ODE wants you to do, there's no book to tell you what it is they want you to do. This goes again to the question many of you have heard me talking about in governance in general, the importance of data integrity. If you don't know what the definitions are, if you don't have systems to determine that we're counting like things, then collecting data is useless because your data is meaningless. So updating the manuals and having them ready to be published concurrently with updates or changes in the system is a critical matter. We would suggest monthly reporting of full-time equivalent estimates, the flagging system that I mentioned earlier, and then the other large policy issue that we think needs to be looked at and have talked with Senator Langer. Look forward to working with Representative Hayes in the House on this. It involves blended learning. For those of you who may or may not know what blended learning is, people my age went to a classroom that had bricks and mortars and a teacher stood in front and told us what we needed to know. And in my day, occasionally hit us when we weren't learning or behaving properly. Obviously, we now have computers and other ways, other tools for learning than just a lecture or reading a book. Blended learning combines both of those ideas so that there is a classroom component and then there is alternative instructional methods which include, but are not limited to, computers and electronic learning. The challenge is, in order to get a year's worth of funding and to have a year experience for students, we have a standard in Ohio of 920 hours of instruction for your traditional classroom-based brick-and-mortar sort of school. Where we have a blended learning model, there is no equivalency to determine the adequacy of, it's just a certification process. And so some of that 920 hours can be supplanted by electronic learning. But how much credit do you get for that? How much does that count? And right now, that's a bit of a morass. There is no statutory guidance and no objective way to weight that. So in a blended learning environment, it's impossible for the auditor of state, for example, to be able to walk in and assess whether a student in a blended learning environment is actually getting the equivalent of 920 hours required by the statute.